Hey everyone, Faisal Khan here, ready to explore the stories that matter? Let's dive in. We will discuss Trump's Greenland scheme and trade war. As January 2026 unfolds, the world watches what has been described as the most serious crisis in transatlantic relations since World War II. President Donald Trump's aggressive campaign to acquire Greenland, combined with an escalating trade war involving massive tariffs, has fundamentally shaken the foundations of NATO and threatened the post-war international order that has maintained relative peace for nearly 8 decades. This crisis represents a collision of Trump's America First foreign policy with the sovereignty rights of allies, international law, and the collective security principles that have underpinned Western cooperation since 1949. The situation has evolved from what many initially dismissed as another Trump provocation into a genuine geopolitical emergency that could reshape global alliances for generations. Trump's interest in Greenland is not entirely new. During his first presidency in 2019, he floated the idea of purchasing the world's largest island from Denmark. The proposal was immediately rejected, with Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen calling it absurd. Trump, offended by the blunt dismissal, cancelled a planned state visit to Denmark. What seemed like a passing fancy during his first term has become a central obsession of his second presidency. Since taking office on January 20, 2025, Trump has escalated his rhetoric about Greenland from speculation to explicit threats, including refusing to rule out military force to achieve his objectives. Greenland spans 849,420 square miles, 4 times the size of Spain, though approximately 80% is covered by thick ice sheet. Despite its sparse population of only 57,000 people, the island holds extraordinary strategic value. Greenland sits between North America and Europe, positioned crucially in the Arctic region. Its capital, Nuuk, is closer to New York, approximately 2,900 kilometers, than to Copenhagen, roughly 3,500 kilometers. This geographic reality has long made Greenland strategically important for North American defense. The United States already operates Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, in northwestern Greenland, hosting about 150 troops. This installation, operational since 1943 under a 1951 U.S.-Denmark defense agreement, houses the 12th Space Warning Squadron, which operates ballistic missile early warning systems and manages part of the U.S. global satellite network. The base has an active airfield and the northernmost deep water port. The melting Arctic ice is opening new shipping lanes and access to resources, while both Russia and China have increased their military activities in the region. Trump has repeatedly claimed, without supporting evidence, that Russian and Chinese ships surround Greenland's coasts, presenting an imminent threat that only American control can counter. Greenland is believed to hold vast deposits of rare earth minerals, oil, and other valuable resources. However, experts note that as of 2023, the U.S. imported only $190 million in rare earths, and these could be more easily obtained from American deposits or other sources. Greenland has never produced petroleum, and previous attempts to mine iron ore ended in bankruptcy. Trump himself framed his interest partly in real estate terms, stating, "It's massive. That should be part of the United States." He has called acquiring Greenland a great deal and suggested it would be a legacy achievement, placing him alongside presidents like Thomas Jefferson and William McKinley, who expanded American territory. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenlanders are also citizens of the European Union through Denmark's membership. The island has significant self-governance under a 2009 Self-Government Act, controlling most domestic affairs while Denmark retains authority over foreign policy, defense, and currency. Greenland has been moving toward independence. In 2023, it unveiled its first draft constitution, calling for the creation of a Greenlandic republic, independence from Denmark, and recognition of the island's Inuit heritage. In March 2025, Greenland's center-right Democratic Party won parliamentary elections, underscoring residents' desire for greater sovereignty, though preferring a gradual approach to independence. The Greenlandic government has been absolutely clear in its rejection of American overtures. Premier Mute Burup Egede wrote, "Greenland is ours. We are not for sale and will never be for sale. We must not lose our long struggle for freedom." Following Trump's latest escalations, Greenlandic Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen stated at a protest, "If we have to choose between the United States and Denmark here and now, we choose Denmark." Opinion polls show approximately 85% of Greenlanders oppose an American takeover. According to Danish national broadcaster DR, Trump's campaign to acquire Greenland has been organized into three main phases since December 2024. This began with symbolic gestures and attempts to win Greenlandic public opinion. Donald Trump Jr. visited Greenland in January 2025, though he did not meet with government officials. His entourage reportedly passed out MAGA hats to locals and attempted to speak to residents via speakerphone. A Greenlandic member of parliament called the visit staged. American influencers with Trump connections have attempted to infiltrate Greenlandic society by handing out dollar bills in the streets of Nuuk, promoting pro-American messages through social media, and creating advertising campaigns aimed at persuading Greenlanders to secede from Denmark. As the charm offensive failed to gain traction, Trump turned to threatening Denmark directly. In December 2025, he appointed Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry as special envoy to Greenland, a one-sided informal role. Landry stated he would work to make Greenland part of the U.S. and planned to attend uninvited traditional Greenlandic events. Denmark summoned the American ambassador and foreign minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen, called Landry's statements completely unacceptable, insisting that everyone, including the U.S., must respect the territorial integrity of the Kingdom of Denmark. Danish Security and Intelligence Service, PET, has monitored at least 3 American men with connections to Trump for attempting to infiltrate Greenland with the purpose of creating discord with Denmark by exploiting or fabricating disagreements. Trump also appointed Tom Dance as leader of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, someone who worked on Greenland issues during Trump's first administration. In a remarkable revelation, Trump explicitly linked his Greenland ambitions to his failure to win the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. In a text message to Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, Trump wrote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America." Trump continued, "The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland." Trump has repeatedly claimed that Norway controls the Nobel Peace Prize, which is awarded by an independent Norwegian committee, despite Norwegian officials' explanations to the contrary. The 2025 prize was awarded to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who later offered it to Trump in a White House meeting. This remarkable admission suggests Trump's policy decisions are being influenced by personal grievances rather than strategic analysis, a concerning prospect given the stakes involved. Trump has refused to rule out using military force to seize Greenland. When asked directly whether he would use force, the president replied, "No comment." His deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, declared, "We're a superpower, and we're going to conduct ourselves as a superpower." Following the successful U.S. intervention in Venezuela and the capture of Nicolas Maduro in early January 2026, Miller's wife, Katie Miller, posted on social media a map of Greenland covered by the American flag with one word, "soon." Stephen Miller himself stated that no one would militarily challenge a U.S. takeover. Such actions would constitute a clear violation of international law. Forcibly annexing territory belonging to another sovereign nation contradicts the United Nations Charter and fundamental principles of international relations established after World War II. It would represent the kind of territorial aggression the international community has worked to prevent since 1945. Denmark has responded to Trump's threats with a mixture of diplomatic firmness and military preparation. Prime Minister Frederiksen has repeatedly stated that Greenland is not for sale and you can't buy other people. More significantly, Frederiksen warned that if the U.S. chooses to attack another NATO country militarily, then everything stops, including NATO and thus the security that has been established since the end of the Second World War. The Danish government announced a double-digit billion amount in krone, between $876 million and $8.7 billion USD, increase in defense spending in Greenland. Danish Defense Minister Troels Lund Poulsen stated that Danish troops would immediately respond to an invasion with force. Rasmus Jarlof, chair of Denmark's Defense Committee, said Denmark would defend its territory and invoke Article 5 of NATO, the Collective Defense Clause, if attacked by the U.S. For the first time in its history, Denmark's official threat assessment, published by the Danish Defense Intelligence Service in 2025, mentioned the United States as a threat to national security, alongside Russia and China. In a powerful show of solidarity, 8 European leaders, from Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement condemning Trump's tariff threats, stating they undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. Multiple NATO countries have deployed military personnel to Greenland. Denmark sent hundreds of elite combat soldiers trained in Arctic warfare, including the chief of the Royal Danish Army, General Peter Harling Boysen. France sent military teams with air, sea, and land components. Germany, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and Finland all confirmed sending military personnel. The operation, known as Arctic Endurance, involves coordinated exercises demonstrating European commitment to defending Danish territory. Both Canada and France announced plans to open consulates in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, signaling long-term commitment to the territory's integrity. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called Trump's use of tariffs against allies completely wrong, though European leaders have been careful to balance their criticism with the need to maintain U.S. engagement in Ukraine and other security matters. Trump's threats against Greenland represent an unprecedented crisis for NATO. The alliance is built on Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. The prospect of NATO's largest and most powerful member attacking another member is almost beyond imagination. EU Defense Commissioner Andrius Kubilius stated bluntly that a US invasion of Greenland would be the end of NATO and that EU members would be under obligation to come to Denmark's assistance. Even Russia has commented on the crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Trump's bid to take over Greenland heralds a deep crisis for NATO, noting sardonically that it upends the Western concept of rule-based global order that Russia has long criticized. He observed that one NATO member is going to attack another NATO member, something hard to imagine before. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has attempted to mediate, with Trump claiming they had agreed to a meeting of various parties in Davos to discuss Greenland. Though this reflects the extraordinary nature of the crisis, NATO allies negotiating over whether one will invade another, Europe faces an agonizing strategic choice. The continent remains dependent on the United States for military support, particularly regarding Ukraine and deterring Russia. Yet Trump is threatening a core European ally and EU member. As one analysis noted, Europe needs US military and diplomatic support to rebuff Russia, putting it in a bind. How to keep the US out of Greenland but invested in Ukraine? This tension was visible when British and French leaders stood alongside Trump's special envoy and son-in-law in Paris to discuss Ukraine's security guarantees. Unable to publicly criticize Trump's Greenland threats lest they jeopardize Washington's involvement in the Ukraine peace process. European leaders are discussing whether to activate the EU anti-coercion instrument to target the US, while also accelerating plans for independent European defense capabilities, recognizing that over-reliance on an unpredictable America poses existential risks. Large-scale protests have erupted both in Greenland and Denmark. In Nuuk, demonstrators gathered almost a third of the city's population, carrying signs reading, "No means no," "Stop threatening us," and "Yankee go home." In January 2026, "Hands off Greenland," protests spread across both territories, with Greenlanders and Danes united in rejecting American pressure. The Greenlandic government issued statements that they cannot under any circumstances accept U.S. demands for Greenland to become part of the U.S., emphasizing that Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. As European resistance to his Greenland ambitions stiffened, Trump deployed his favored weapon, tariffs. On Saturday, January 17, 2026, he announced he would impose a 10% tariff on goods from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland starting February 1st, 2026, increasing to 25% on June 1st, and remaining in place until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. This represented a dramatic escalation, particularly since many of these countries had just deployed military forces to Greenland as part of Arctic endurance exercises, defensive preparations that Trump characterized as provocative. The threatened tariffs came despite trade deals already negotiated with some of these countries. The EU had reached a framework agreement in August 2025, setting duties at 15% on most imports, with commitments for hundreds of billions of dollars in European investment in the United States. Trump's Greenland tariffs are part of a much larger trade war that has redefined American economic policy since he took office in January 2025. From January to April 2025, the overall average effective U.S. tariff rate rose from 2.5% to an estimated 27%, the highest level in over a century. While subsequent negotiations lowered this to approximately 16.8% by November 2025, it still represents a massive departure from recent American trade policy. U.S. tariff revenue jumped from approximately $100 billion in 2024 to $300 billion in 2025, with tariff revenue's share among federal taxes rising from 2.1% to 6.1%. Trump has invoked two primary legal authorities for his tariffs: the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IPEA, which allows the president to regulate economic transactions in response to declared emergencies. Trump declared the influx of illegal aliens and illicit drugs a national emergency to justify tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, and later declared that large trade deficits posed a national emergency to justify tariffs on virtually all trading partners. Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which allows tariffs on grounds of national security. Trump raised steel, aluminum, and copper tariffs to 50% under this authority and introduced 25% tariffs on imported cars and 100% tariffs on some pharmaceuticals. The timeline of Trump's trade war includes February 1st, 2025, 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, 10% on China. February 10th, 2025, 25% flat rate on steel and aluminum. March 4th, 2025, 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada take effect. Tariffs on Chinese imports double to 20%. March 26, 2025, 25% tariff on imported cars and light trucks. April 2nd, 2025, Liberation Day, announcement of tariffs on virtually all countries, ranging from 10 to 41%, August 6, 2025. Additional 25% tariff on India for importing Russian oil, September 30th, 2025. 10% on timber, lumber, 25% on furniture, January 14, 2026. 25% tariff on certain AI chips, January 17, 2026. Greenland-related tariffs announced on 8 European countries. Countries worldwide have responded with their own tariffs on American goods. The exact scale of retaliation varies by country, but it has created a genuine global trade war with cascading economic consequences. China, engaged in an escalating tit-for-tat with the U.S., saw tensions ease somewhat with temporary truces. In May 2025, the two countries agreed to reduce tariffs from 125% to 10% for 90 days. This truce was extended multiple times, most recently through November 10, 2026, as both sides continue broader negotiations. However, Trump threatened to blow up this fragile ceasefire by announcing that countries doing business with Iran would face 25% duties, a move that could ensnare China, a top importer of Iranian oil. The tariffs function as a tax on American consumers and businesses, despite Trump's repeated claims that foreign countries pay them. In reality, U.S. importers pay these fees, which are typically passed on to consumers through higher prices. According to the Tax Foundation's analysis, the tariffs will amount to an average tax increase of $1,100 per U.S. household in 2025 and $1,500 in 2026. In 2025, Trump's tariffs increased federal tax revenues by $143.8 billion, or 0.47% of GDP, making them the largest tax hike since 1993. After-tax incomes will be reduced by 0.3 to 0.9% on average. The tariffs represent the largest U.S. tax increase as a percent of GDP since 1993. Manufacturing has been particularly hard hit, shedding 70,000 jobs since Trump unveiled his Liberation Day duties in April 2025. Economist Arthur Laffer estimated car prices would increase by 4,711 due to auto tariffs. The legality of Trump's tariff authority, particularly under IEPA, is being contested in courts. On May 28, 2025, the United States Court of International Trade ruled that Trump had exceeded his authority under AIPA, finding the tariffs illegal because the triggering emergencies bore no rational connection to the trade measures imposed. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit upheld this decision on August 29, 2025. However, the rulings were stayed pending appeal, allowing the tariffs to remain in effect. The Supreme Court consolidated the cases and heard arguments in November 2025, with a decision expected in January 2026. This legal uncertainty adds another layer of complexity to the trade war, as billions of dollars in tariff revenue could potentially be subject to refunds if courts ultimately invalidate Trump's actions. To reduce the economic damage and political pressure, Trump has negotiated framework agreements with various countries. United Kingdom, May 8, 2025. U.S. eliminated tariffs on British airplane parts and metals up to quotas. Reduced car tariffs from 25 to 10%. UK eliminated tariffs on U.S. ethanol and increased beef import quotas. Japan, July 22, 2025. Lowered tariffs on auto imports to 15%. South Korea, July 30, 2025. Reduced planned levies to 15%. Indonesia, July 15, 2025. Framework agreement reducing tariffs from 32 to 19% EU, August 21, 2025. Framework deal setting duties at 15% on most imports, with commitments for massive European investment in the US. However, Trump's willingness to threaten new tariffs over Greenland, despite existing agreements with European countries, demonstrates that these deals provide limited protection against his unpredictable trade policy. Trump has promoted tariffs as an alternative to domestic taxation, proposing an external revenue service to collect tariff revenue. In his January 20th, 2025 inaugural address, he proclaimed, "We are establishing the External Revenue Service to collect all tariffs, duties, and revenues. It will be massive amounts of money pouring into our treasury coming from foreign sources." As of the end of December 2025, this External Revenue Service had not been established. The concept reflects Trump's misunderstanding of how tariffs work. They are paid by American importers and ultimately American consumers, not by foreign governments, making them a form of domestic taxation rather than foreign revenue. The combination of unpredictable tariff policy, legal challenges, and constant threats has created enormous economic uncertainty. Businesses cannot plan investments when they don't know what tariff rates will apply. Consumers face rising prices. Supply chains built over decades are being disrupted. Federal Reserve reports from various districts noted that while some firms had adjusted to tariff stability late in 2025, Trump's new Greenland-related tariffs represent a sharp reversal, plunging trade-exposed sectors back into uncertainty. Trump's Greenland campaign gained new momentum following the successful U.S. intervention in Venezuela in early January 2026, which resulted in the capture of President Nicolás Maduro. This military success appears to have emboldened the administration, with officials suggesting that if the U.S. could topple a hostile regime in Latin America, seizing an island from an ally would be even easier. The Trump administration has framed its actions under what it calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring this is our hemisphere in State Department communications. This represents a dramatic assertion of American regional dominance that extends beyond traditional Monroe Doctrine concepts to encompass territories currently under Allied control. Despite Trump's claims about Russian and Chinese threats to Greenland, the actual strategic situation is more nuanced. The United States already has substantial access to Greenland through Pituffik Space Base and the 1951 defense agreement with Denmark. This arrangement has functioned effectively for over 70 years without requiring American sovereignty over the island. Both Denmark and the US are NATO allies with a long-running bilateral defense partnership, including shared patrols around Greenland. The existing NATO framework provides mechanisms for enhanced cooperation on Arctic security without annexation. Denmark has committed to massive increases in Greenland defense spending and has been willing to discuss expanded US military presence. Copenhagen has not been an obstruction to American security interests in the Arctic. As Senator Mark Warner, Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, noted, Trump's claims about Russian and Chinese threats surrounding Greenland are fictitious. While both countries have increased Arctic activities, the situation does not justify the extraordinary measures Trump proposes. Bloomberg's Javier Blas noted that hyperbole around Greenland and commodities has a 50-year-long history. Greenland has never produced petroleum, and the attempt to mine iron ore ended in bankruptcy. Most potential mineral sites are north of the Arctic Circle and remain largely inaccessible. American and other deposits could more easily provide necessary rare earths than Greenland's theoretical resources. Richard N. Haas, a veteran American diplomat and foreign policy expert, stated that Trump's actions are turning upside down what America has worked to build over 75 years. The Wall Street Journal editorial board warned that Trump is enabling the fondest dream of Russian strategy to divide Western Europe from the US and break the NATO alliance. The crisis demonstrates several alarming departures from traditional American foreign policy, contempt for international law. Trump has expressed open disdain for international legal constraints, suggesting that American power justifies taking what it wants. Coercion of allies. Rather than working with allies to address shared concerns, Trump is threatening and attempting to coerce them. Personal grievances. Driving policy. The Nobel Peace Prize connection reveals that personal slights, not strategic analysis, may be driving major foreign policy decisions. Economic blackmail. Using tariffs as weapons against allies over non-trade issues represents a fundamental misuse of economic policy tools. The crisis is accelerating European efforts to reduce dependence on the United States. Independent defense. EU members are discussing enhanced military cooperation and the development of an independent European defense capability. While this process will take years, estimates suggest 3 to 5 years to adequately rearm, the crisis has dramatically increased political will for such efforts. Economic tools. Germany has backed using the EU's anti-coercion instrument against the United States, a mechanism designed to counter economic blackmail. Political coordination. The unified European response to Trump's threats, while carefully calibrated to avoid completely alienating Washington, demonstrates growing European cohesion on security matters. Arctic presence. The deployment of forces to Greenland and plans to establish consulates in Nuuk signal long-term European commitment to maintaining territorial integrity against American pressure. Trump's Greenland campaign has prompted some criticism even from within his own party. Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska said, "This is appalling. Greenland is a NATO ally. Denmark is one of our best friends. So the way we're treating them is really demeaning and it has no upside. It's great for Putin, Xi, and other adversaries who want to see NATO divided. However, congressional resistance has been limited. Most Republicans have remained silent, or offered only tepid criticism, unwilling to challenge a president who maintains strong support among their base voters. The question of whether Congress will show resolve in checking Trump's actions remains largely unanswered. Some Republican lawmakers have traveled to Greenland to express support for Danish sovereignty, but these gestures have not translated into legislative action to constrain the president's tariff authority or clarify the limits of executive power in foreign affairs. The crisis has international dimensions beyond Europe. China ended 2025 with a record-breaking trade surplus, exceeding $1 trillion despite Trump's tariffs, suggesting that Beijing weathered the opening salvos of the trade war relatively successfully. Chinese officials and analysts view Trump's Greenland campaign and broader America First approach as evidence of American retreat from global leadership in favor of regional dominance. This perception could accelerate Chinese efforts to position itself as a more reliable international partner, particularly in the developing world. The fragile US-China tariff truce could collapse if Trump follows through on threats to punish countries trading with Iran, potentially reigniting the most damaging aspects of the trade war. In this optimistic scenario, intense diplomatic efforts produce a face-saving compromise. Trump might secure enhanced U.S. military access to Greenland, obtain commitments for increased Danish defense spending in the Arctic, win symbolic concessions that he can present as victories, drop tariff threats in exchange for renewed European commitments to NATO spending targets. This would require Trump to accept that full annexation is impossible while allowing him to claim he strengthened American security. European leaders would need to provide enough concessions for Trump to declare victory without actually ceding sovereignty. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has signaled openness to negotiations rather than military action, suggesting this path remains possible. NATO Secretary General Rutte's mediation efforts could facilitate such an outcome. A darker possibility involves continued escalation. Trump implements the threatened 25% tariffs on European goods. European Union responds with retaliatory tariffs on American exports. A full-blown transatlantic trade war severely damages both economies. NATO cooperation deteriorates as mutual trust erodes. The alliance becomes effectively defunct even without formal dissolution. This scenario would fulfill Russian strategic objectives of dividing the West without Moscow firing a shot. It would leave Europe more vulnerable to Russian pressure while America becomes more isolated internationally. While most analysts consider actual military action unlikely, Trump has refused to rule it out. A military confrontation could unfold if Trump orders military forces to assert control over parts of Greenland. Denmark invokes Article 5, calling on NATO allies for collective defense. European forces respond to defend Danish territory. The United States finds itself in armed conflict with multiple NATO allies. This scenario would be catastrophic, ending NATO and fundamentally reshaping global security. It would represent an unprecedented failure of Western cooperation and could trigger economic chaos globally. Most experts believe Trump is using military threats primarily as leverage, rather than genuinely intending invasion. However, the Venezuela intervention demonstrated his willingness to use military force when he believes it will succeed. The Supreme Court could rule Trump's IEEPA tariffs illegal in early 2026, forcing him to withdraw or significantly modify his tariff threats. This would undermine Trump's primary economic weapon, require him to seek congressional authorization for tariffs, potentially force refunds of billions in collected tariff revenue, constrain future presidents' ability to unilaterally impose tariffs. However, even if courts limit his tariff authority, Trump retains other tools, including Section 232 national security tariffs and diplomatic pressure. European leaders might calculate that accommodating Trump on certain issues is necessary to maintain American engagement in Ukraine and other vital security matters. This could involve quietly accepting enhanced U.S. presence in Greenland, avoiding formal confrontation over sovereignty questions, focusing on containing damage to NATO while preparing for post-Trump realignment, accelerating European defense independence as long-term insurance. This reflects the painful reality that Europe remains militarily dependent on the United States in the short term, even as it pursues greater autonomy for the future. Trump's Greenland campaign and trade war represent more than a bilateral dispute. They challenge the fundamental architecture of the post-World War II international order. The system built on multilateral cooperation, respect for sovereignty, and rule-based trade is being replaced by what Trump's deputy chief of staff called conducting ourselves as a superpower, meaning the strong take what they can. This represents American abandonment of the principles it championed for 75 years. Rather than leading an alliance of democracies united by shared values, Trump envisions an America that unilaterally asserts dominance based solely on power. European leaders have warned that Trump's threats have fundamentally undermined trust in the United States as a security and economic partner. Even if the immediate crisis is resolved, the damage to transatlantic relations may be lasting. Future European governments will remember that an American president threatened military action against an ally over personal grievances. They will factor this into long-term strategic planning, accelerating trends toward European strategic autonomy that began during Trump's first term. Trump's Greenland campaign has potential implications far beyond the Arctic. If the United States can threaten military action to seize Allied territory, what message does this send about? China's claims to Taiwan, Russia's territorial ambitions in former Soviet states. Other territorial disputes worldwide. Trump's actions undermine American credibility when criticizing territorial aggression by adversaries. How can Washington condemn Russian annexation of Ukrainian territory while simultaneously threatening to annex Greenland? Whether or not courts ultimately validate Trump's tariff authority, he has fundamentally changed American trade policy. The era of steadily reducing trade barriers through multilateral agreements appears over, replaced by transactional bilateral deals enforced by tariff threats. This represents the most dramatic shift in American trade policy since the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which contributed to the Great Depression and led to decades of trade liberalization. Trump is deliberately reversing that liberalization in pursuit of manufacturing jobs, government revenue, and geopolitical leverage. The long-term economic consequences remain uncertain, but the immediate effects include higher consumer prices, supply chain disruptions, and reduced American competitiveness in some sectors. Trump's dismissal of international law and multilateral institutions accelerates the erosion of global governance structures. If the United States, the world's most powerful country and traditional champion of international law, openly disregards legal constraints, why should other nations respect them? This trend toward might makes right international relations, increases the risk of conflicts, and makes cooperation on global challenges like climate change more difficult. Regardless of how the Greenland crisis resolves, it has focused attention on the Arctic's growing strategic importance. Climate change is opening new shipping routes and resource access, while great power competition is extending into polar regions. The crisis will likely accelerate militarization of the Arctic by all parties, with expanded deployments, infrastructure development, and potential for future conflicts in a region that has historically been relatively peaceful. Trump's campaign also reflects domestic political dynamics. His base supporters appreciate his aggressive assertion of American interests and dismissal of international constraints. The Greenland issue allows him to position himself as a bold leader willing to make America greater through territorial expansion. However, the economic costs of the trade war, higher prices, and job losses in trade-dependent sectors could eventually erode political support if Americans conclude the costs exceed the benefits. The convergence of Trump's Greenland ambitions and trade war represents a genuine inflection point in international relations. The outcome will help determine whether the post-World War II international order can adapt and survive, or whether it will be replaced by a more anarchic system based on power rather than rules. Several factors will prove decisive. European unity. Can European nations maintain solidarity in the face of American pressure, or will Trump successfully divide them by exploiting different interests and dependencies? American democratic institutions. Will Congress, courts, or public opinion constrain Trump's actions, or does executive power extend to threatening allies and imposing tariffs without meaningful checks? Economic reality. Will the costs of the trade war become so severe that political pressure forces policy changes, or can Trump sustain his approach despite economic damage? International response. Will other nations accept a world where American power trumps international law, or will they organize to constrain unilateral American actions? Trump's calculations. Is Trump genuinely willing to sacrifice NATO, damage the economy, and isolate America to achieve his objectives, or will he ultimately settle for negotiated compromises? What began as seemingly another Trump provocation has evolved into the most serious transatlantic crisis in generations. The stakes extend far beyond Greenland itself to encompass the future of NATO, the transatlantic relationship, international law, and the basic rules governing relations